What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Ultra Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Corcione, for another episode here of the Western States 100 Preview Series, where we're interviewing some of the top athletes toeing the line in Olympic Valley, California, making the 100-mile journey out to the endurance capital of the world, Auburn, California, for the 50th anniversary running of the Western States 100. And I'm super stoked to have our guest on here today. It's our first time chatting here on the podcast, but been a huge fan over the past few years, especially she is the reigning champion at UTMB, coming off an impressive bout last year at the race as well. And she's also been stringing up just this winning streak of other races since then as well. And she'll be towing the line at Western States for the very first time this upcoming week, which is just so awesome to see. And I've always enjoyed following her training, her content, how much she shares about the process. I think that is so cool that you give people an insight to, what your training is like and what's going through your head, which is awesome. And so I'm super stoked and honored to have no other than North Face athlete Katie Schide to the Everyday Ultra Podcast. Katie, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really an honor to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad I got back to you this time. Sorry about last year.
It's all good. I mean, I know when we were emailing, it was right after UTMB and you were making the media rounds and everything. So I can totally get how probably everybody was trying to get you on the podcast at the time. So totally understand. And I'm stoked to have you on now because, this is your first time running the race. And I definitely want to talk about, what it means to you and kind of some pre-race thoughts. But the cool thing is right now you're in Flagstaff and you've been spending a lot of time training there over the past few months. And you're known for usually being on the other side of the pond in the mountains. And that's where you do a lot of your training lead up to UTMB. So how has it been training in Flagstaff? And tell me a little bit more about, that new location in terms of training and everything like that leading up to Western States.
Yeah, it's been really cool to be back in the US for such an extended period of time. This is the longest I've spent continuously in the US in 7 years. So yeah, it's been a little bit of a culture shock at first and then for sure settling in. But yeah, I am already getting a little antsy to get back home to the mountains. But it's been really cool being here. Flagstaff is a cool place to be for a runner. And yeah, I feel like I heard so much about it before coming here, and it's cool to just kind of make my own opinions and learn the trails and yeah, kind of connect with the people who are based here.
Super cool. So this is your first time really immersing yourself in Flagstaff, correct?
Yeah, this is my first time my first time in Flagstaff.
Super cool. So I'm curious because everyone knows it as the endurance mecca, one of the endurance meccas, I should say, of the United States. And you're coming from one of the endurance meccas, of Europe and let alone the world. I guess what are the big maybe key differences or things that you've noticed, or maybe things that have been helpful here that, might be different over there, or kind of vice versa? When you look at the two kind of training environments, how do you compare those, with the training you've been putting in?
So I actually don't come from a training mecca at all in France. I live in a very, very tiny village of 60 people in the middle of nowhere. I think it's easy to think that I live close to Chamonix, but I don't live close to Chamonix. I live in the winter, it's an 8-hour drive, and in the summer, it's 5. So it's actually not that close. But that's the reason we live there, is because it's so far from everything. And it's a place where my partner, Jean, who's also a professional trail runner, a place where we can really just disconnect and feel that we have our time, our quiet time in the mountains, and really we can focus on training, but we can also, it's also just a place that I would want to live outside of sport, regardless of what I'm doing in the sport. But yeah, to get back to your question, yeah, so it's very different because here there's stores and other people and trails that are built, that have names. And yeah, there's a big road running population here. So that's been kind of fun to see. Probably Olympians I'm passing by in the grocery store. And yeah, that's something we don't have at home. And the landscape, of course, is completely different. Where we live, it's it's the Alps. So you are going up or down and not usually very horizontal. And here it's a lot of, you can go, you can find some steeper trails, but for the most part, it's just like a lot of really like fast, runnable, a lot of mountain bike trails. So I mean, that's why I came, because I just don't have places like that to run at home. So for sure I could have like prepared in some way at home, but it wouldn't have been, I don't think it would have been as like thorough or relevant to Western states.
Yeah, and it's so cool to see you take that specificity approach in your training, right? Like looking at UTMB and just how successful you've been with your training out there, getting familiar with that type of terrain and everything, and how it led to, great success among many, many other factors that, went into that too. But that race specificity in your training, I feel like has to play a part. And it's so cool to see you taking that same principle, coming to the States and doing a little bit more specific stuff relative to the Western states course as well. Speaking about Western states, you recently posted something saying it was just, surreal to be, be in the race that, has meant a lot to you since like you've really gotten into the sport and everything like that. So I'm curious, like, tell me what I guess Western states mean to you. And then also too, like, cause I know, obviously you won UTMB last year too. What was the decision maybe to do UTMB first? Was that like a conscious decision or maybe just like something that you kind of had as a plan? Or I'm curious to hear, like, knowing that Western states is an important race to you. What was your thought process behind going UTMB first and then states?
So I would actually say I'm not sure if Western States was an important race to me, because it wasn't something I'd ever done. I have I've never even been, my first steps on the course were a month ago when I was doing kind of like a recon trip. So I really had no like emotions attached to the race at all. I just knew that like with UTMB, it's the most competitive ultra race in the world. So yeah, I wouldn't say, I mean, I'm excited to make it an important race to me. And I think that will happen once I actually run it. Right now, it's just kind of like this looming objective. So I'm not really sure where my emotions are exactly about it yet. For sure, UTMB was like something that interested me first because it just matches how I would typically approach my running. That's just where I come from, like more of a hiking background. I grew up playing like team sports and did a lot of hiking. And then I did like quite a bit of sky running races and like races in the Alps. So it just made sense to do, like, why would I fly to the US to run on flat trails when like I live on trails that are similar to UTMB? I'm like, I can drive there. It's closer. Obviously in the French culture, it's way more important than Western states, just like Western states is way more important than UTMB to a lot of Americans. So UTMB just made sense. And also there's always this thing with like Western states was, I would always say, yeah, but it's like so hard to plan around. It's so hard to get into. To get a golden ticket in the past, I would have had to completely give up my ski season and then train for a race in the desert in the US, which I wouldn't have been able to train for in the Alps get a golden ticket in the spring. But then if you plan your whole spring around this race and something goes wrong, then there was like a lot of steps that weren't certain. And I really like, in like November, kind of planning my race schedule for next year. I don't like this uncertainty of like, okay, I'm going to give up a whole ski season to try to get a golden ticket. Maybe I don't get it. And then what?
Yeah. And if you want to do UTMB too, then you have to like do the double, which is like a beast, like on its own for sure.
Yeah, that's not something that interests me right now. So yeah. So anyway, that's why UTMB has always been the first choice in the past.
Yeah, and I like how you think through like the other things that you want to involve yourself in, right? Like doing the ski season and like thinking about the logistics, and it makes it so much more complicated too when like you're living all the way across in another country as well. So it's super cool to see you, taking into consideration all the things, like, because I think it can be easy to look at any race that's like super big, and if it doesn't align maybe with your training interests at the time, or maybe sacrificing some other things, like it can be, at least in my perspective, making those wrong choices for me. It can lead to, the sacrifice of something you really want to do, which I know, you're big into skiing, which is like super cool to see that. Kind kind of pivoting, but still in the vein of like training for Western States. I know, like you mentioned a while back, there was like a little bit of like a foot issue that you were dealing with, and you were on the bike a lot. But looking at your Strava, like over like, the past few months, you've roared back. I mean, at least in my perspective, and coming back. So tell me, I guess, like that process from, maybe feeling like the injury and then kind of building back from there. And I also want to say, I do appreciate how when you put it on Instagram, you said, hey, I don't, I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I just want, to share updates on the process, which I thought was cool. So kind of giving us a little bit deeper look in the process, like what was that like to catch it, like rehab it, and then get back to training, where you are currently today leading into the race?
Yeah, that was really tough because it was like 2 days after I arrived here. So,
Oh, wow.
I had been planning this big trip to come here and train. And just like with the sole purpose of training for Western States, I just said goodbye to my partner for like 2 months. And I get here and then I go for a run and like get back, and my foot is just in so much pain. Um, and then was quickly just like on Zwift for I think I actually only took like 4 or 5 like full days off of running completely before I started like doing some walk jogging and then easy runs. But still, like mentally, it kind of it's hard to get through that because yeah, there was a lot of things that were really hard about it, and it really sucked. And yeah, I'm not gonna like sugarcoat that. And yeah, but but yeah, when I look back on my training following that, I'm like, okay, I still did what I wanted to do. Maybe there was some easier days than I expected, but yeah, all you can do with training is like the best you can do. So I can't change it at this point. So it's just like part of my, it's just there. And yeah, in the end, maybe it was everyone likes to, spin it like, oh, maybe it was for the best. But yeah, maybe it gave me a little extra rest when I got here because we are at altitude here. So maybe it just like kind of helped me keep it chill for a week before ramping things up again. But I will say the one benefit of like kind of being injured in Flagstaff is there's actually really great physiotherapists here, as opposed to being an hour and a half drive from the closest city where I would be at home, and then trying to manage things in French would have been a huge struggle. So this was actually, if I had to be injured, even though it sucked, this was maybe the best situation.
Yeah, I gotta imagine like being a physiotherapist in Flagstaff is probably just a great career choice too, because you probably like always have business. But yeah, that's awesome to hear that like you were able to, bounce back. And yeah, totally can understand how that can be like suck and just be rough. I mean, I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to thinking about an injury. On like the mental side of things, like how do you assess those kind of things like relatively close to race? It wasn't like too close, but I know in the past, and I'm kind of speaking from my prior experience, like I've had times where, maybe a little niggle pops up like kind of like a month before a race, and you start getting the thoughts like, oh man, like what do I do? Like how do you approach it? And I know it sounds like it's still rough, and that's something I think a lot of people can relate with for sure, but how do you almost switch your mindset to be productive as opposed to maybe letting it hinder or make bad decisions based on, either running through it or anything like that? Like, what is your kind of thought process to be able to make sure your body's intact when you toe the line and get back to training beforehand?
I mean, I rely really heavily on my coach, Jason Koop, and then also the physiotherapist that I was seeing here, and just like asking for outside opinion. And yeah, taking your own feeling into account too. But I do really just like finding people you trust, that sometimes it's someone else telling you like, you're actually fine. Like your brain might be saying otherwise while you're running, but you're actually fine. And just like kind of hearing that, or maybe the opposite. Maybe it's like you think you're fine, but really like we have time. I think at some point it was like we have time, so let's like be conservative here. And then towards the end it was like you're okay. Like just keep doing it. Like it's not going to just instantly go away. But
Mm.
if we can train through some low level of discomfort, like it could be worth it as long as it's not getting worse. So yeah, it's kind of finding a balance there. Yeah, not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I like how you mention how it like taking account the long game, because when you're so close to a race, and again, I've done this at times before when I was very naive, is like, oh, I'm just going to run through it because I just don't have as much time, or maybe that's something that I'm putting in my head. And then it puts you back even further than if you just took the days off and saw a physiotherapist and hopped on the bike. And so I really like that approach of you knowing that, hey, a little time's off is okay. And then to your point, it's like, you're going to be okay. It's not going to go away overnight, but you're going to be okay. I love that as well. You mentioned Koop, which is your coach, very obviously well known and revered into the ultra community, and it's super cool to see you working with him, you know, leading up to UTMB and getting all of his knowledge and expertise. I'm curious, like with UTMB and Western States, with your conversations with him, maybe how different of a, is there any kind of difference in conversations? Is it kind of the same stuff, or like what have the talks been with him as you build to Western States to help you, you know, get more in tune for a race like this versus, you know, a race like Chamonix? I'd love to hear maybe that coach athlete relationship with you've shared on other podcasts leading into UTMB. So curious to hear what that's been like leading up to Western States.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's been like hugely different than, well, I think, at least from my perspective, it's been hugely different than before UTMB, because UTMB was a race I had already done. I'd done UTMB twice and had done
Mm.
CCC once before we started working together. So I felt like, you know, I have logistics dialed, like I know everything, like I know the race better than he does. So it wasn't that I wasn't like relying on him for, you know, like, oh, what is, you know, this part like, and what is this part like? And yeah, what, like, you know, what do I need to keep in mind there? But for Western States, it's like I'm so far out of my comfort zone, and it's a race he knows really well. So
Mm.
I feel like we've been way more in touch for this, like pre-Western States, like yeah, like what are the cooling strategies, like how does it work with ice, what are the aid stations like, yeah, more just basically all the things you would know if you've run the race before, which I haven't. So yeah, I feel like logistically we've been talking a lot more. Obviously on the training side it's like pretty similar.
Yeah, it's so cool to hear that. And I think that's one of the big values of a guy like Coop who has all that experience is like, sure, he can write you an awesome training plan. Sure, he can, you know, be on the side of like the physiology and all that kind of stuff. But his vast experience of the course, I feel like can be just be so helpful, right? And even just those like little like 1 to 2% tips that seem small, like can make all the difference, like the cooling, like the aid station management and all that stuff. Kind of speaking on that same vein with the cooling, right? Like with the heat and everything like that, you know, you're in Arizona right now in Flagstaff at higher elevation and lower temps, of course. But with the heat, when you think about that and that kind of being relatively, you know, different and very different, I should say, not relatively, than UTMB and kind of some of the other mountain races that more traditionally you're getting into. How has that been? Maybe, you know, looking at that into your training, doing some heat adaptation. Curious to hear like that kind of approach, because it's, to your point, a variable that's just so like big, and I'm curious to hear, you know, how you've been approaching that.
Yeah, I mean I've been I mean mostly just using the sauna, but then also trying to get some bigger runs in, like in the Grand Canyon and in
Mm.
Sedona, where it can be hotter. And then just running on the course for, I was in Auburn for like 5 days in
Mm.
May. So kind of just seeing the course and getting a feel for like what the climate is like there, which is pretty similar to here, maybe a little bit more humid.
Mm.
Um, yeah, otherwise, like actually, I mean, I've already obviously started looking at the weather forecast, and it doesn't look out of control. So it might actually be okay. But yeah, mostly just the sauna and running in the sun. And yeah, actually, I did the coastal challenge in Costa Rica in
Oh,
February.
nice.
And part of that was just like to mentally have some experience running in the heat and being wet and that sort of thing. Obviously, those like heat adaptations aren't carrying over to June, but just mentally knowing what it feels like. And I think that gave me a lot of confidence that I could run in the sun in the heat. I feel like coming from Maine, I always, and then kind of really loving winter, like I always kind of tout myself as like not being good in the heat, but I
Mm.
think I was able to prove to myself like I can do it. And yeah, that gave me some confidence.
Yeah, you raise a really good point there, because there is the like, right, the heat adaptation thing, getting your body like in the capabilities it is to handle the heat. But I love that you touched on the mental part. Like, cause I think sometimes even when we get adapted, or sometimes it's just, I mean, to me, and I live in Phoenix, so it's like, you know, almost perpetually hot here. Like to me, no matter how heat adapted it is, it's hard for me. Like it's always kind of hard. And I think a lot of people can relate. So like, talk to me about that mental side of the heat. Cause we hear all the time, like sauna and like, you know, running out in the middle of the day and like getting like heat adapted. But like, how did you deal like when you're doing the coastal challenge, like the mental side of, you know, feeling hot and having the sun beat down on you? Like like how did you mentally prep for that heat, like a little bit more in specific detail?
I think it's more just, you know, running for 6 days in the heat and finishing and being like, I'm still alive and nothing disastrous happened. There was one day where that was really, really rough at the end for me. And I was like walking on this flat dirt road, flat, like paved road, because I was just totally cooked. So I think kind of looking back and seeing like, okay, I didn't take the right, you know, cooling strategies there, which was harder because there was no ice. So
Oh, no ice.
yeah,
Whoa.
yeah, which I was running a lot with Marianne Hogan, and she told me like, actually, you know what, Western States isn't as bad as this because there's like ice all the time and there's more aid stations, so you have more of a chance to like cool down in between. So that made me feel a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure. I can't even imagine being in a very hot race without ice, because I think like that, sure, like you can like wet yourself and have like the water, but even just having like the ice bandana or just having that like extra like intense cold, I think is the world difference. So that's cool that you like ran that experience and then at the end look and say, hey, I made it through. Sure, there were some rough patches, but didn't kill me. And I think it can be with heat or anything else to think, oh man, like this race, I'm not gonna make it in the heat or anything like that. But knowing it's like, no, I made it through, and kind of like to your point, giving yourself the confidence through results that you can make it through, which is super cool. Talking about the Western States course a little bit, you mentioned you were out there in Auburn running on the trails. Was there anything that maybe surprised you out there about being on the trails and running on the course that or maybe just some notable highlights for you that you've kind of taken mental note of like before the race? Like curious to hear like maybe any learnings or surprises that may have came from running on the course, if there were any, that is.
Yeah, so I was only able to see Robinson Flat to the end.
Mm,
And when I was there, it was the weekend before the Memorial Day training camp.
mhm.
There was even more snow than when they were there. So I actually only saw snow from Robinson to like after Miller, like I don't know, maybe 15K after Robinson.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't actually like really see the trail there, but I think what did surprise me was that I think Western States, at least in Europe, is described as basically like running on a dirt road for 100 miles, and that this was like not the case at all. For sure, there's like really, really, really fast sections, but going through the canyons, there's like legitimate trails. They're not especially technical, but they are actually trails, and you do have to like, you know, make some tight turns, and it's not just like running as fast as you possibly can on a dirt road for at least for that last section. And from what I hear, the first 50K is also trail. So if it's really trail running for like, I don't know, the first 80K, that's quite a bit of the race. And
Yeah.
it is still trail at the end. It's just really fast, like from the river to the end.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Even yeah, I think here in the States too, sometimes people say, oh yeah, it's an extremely runnable, you know, 100 miler for the most part. But yeah, I've been on some parts of the course and you're like, okay, well, I don't know, like this part, you definitely need to focus a little more bit. Like it's not like you can just check out on a dirt road to your point and just cruise. Like sometimes you got to watch your footing a little bit, make those hairpin turns. Like, I think it's like I think it's one of those courses that knowing nothing about Western States, if you look at like the profile and it being like net downhill and like maybe just hearing a little bit about like the buffed out trails, like I think on paper, a lot of people can maybe discount some of the things that aren't like, taken into consideration until you're actually there. Like to your point of all those like little things as well. You mentioned too, like the first 50K of the course being on trail. Word is a lot of snow up there too. Do you feel like you have an edge? And this might be an obvious question, but I'm curious to hear your approach. Do you feel like you have an edge at that like initial, first few parts coming out of Olympic Valley with all that snow, maybe over someone who is in the US and, doesn't have as much experience on that? Like, I'm curious how you're approaching that first kind of snow section, if it's still there, which it might likely be given the pictures of I've seen, but curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm getting a lot of mixed information about the snow because
Yeah.
when I check the actual SnowTel site, it's like dry now.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but I think there is still quite a bit of like more snow than it's not dry. Let's say that. So there will be snow at some point. But yeah, actually, Ida Nilsson and I were just talking about this the other day. She was like, "Yeah, everyone's telling us we'll be good on the snow, but like they don't understand. Like we don't run on snow. We're like we ski on snow. Uh,
Mm.
so, like it's for sure. I have like an understanding of like the material itself and maybe where and where not to put my feet, but I do not spend the winter running on snow. I would say probably the Americans or some of the Americans who maybe live in a place like Salt Lake City where there are like accessible trails that are covered in snow. They probably have a lot more experience running on snow than I do because anytime it snows, I'm on skis.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Does it, and this is a very naive question because I've never honestly skied in my life, but do you feel like that skiing translates to running on snow a lot? And like, I know to your point, it really like lets you know about the texture itself and like the actual material. But again, naive question here for from a non-skier myself. Like, what do you think would translate well to actually running on snow and maybe that first 50K?
No, I think it's just more general. I mean, for sure, like Ida and I live in the snow, so we have a better understanding of like what it's like to run on snow than someone who maybe like you living in Phoenix the whole year, probably less experience with snow. So, yeah, I mean, I guess compared to someone who has very, very, very little snow experience, I would have an edge. I would say I also like it's more, from what I hear, it's more like my style of running. It's like a bit more like in quotes like real trail running as opposed to these like buffed out sections. So who knows? I mean, I think it'll be a fast start regardless with the number of women who are going to be pushing at the start. So yeah, who knows?
It'll definitely be an interesting start for sure. Yeah. And yeah, it's a one of those things where I'm really looking and curious to see what it's actually going to be on race days. Cause to your point, I've heard mixed things as well. Like I'm seeing one picture here, but someone's like, yeah, it's dry. And I'm seeing another picture here and all at the same time. So it'll be curious to see what the conditions are. But yeah, to your point, I think it's going to be an interesting start for sure. And seeing how people adapt and react to it. And yeah, I know if I was out there, I would be like snow looks very foreign to me right now being in Phoenix. So totally, totally get that. Kind of like wrapping on like more, broader notes, winning UTMB last year, like such an amazing experience. Are there any lessons or takeaways from that specific race that maybe you're taking to Western States? I know they're completely different courses for the most part, right? Very different kind of races as you kind of highlighted in your conversations with Koop, but maybe from like a higher level, is there a lesson, like a few lessons, or maybe one lesson in particular that you're really taking into this race, being that this is another highly competitive race and, using from the experience that you have coming on top of it, another incredibly experienced and competitive race?
I think the only like really big thing is just that it's okay to like not get the thing right how you want it the first time. And yeah, I had two really disappointing years at UTMB, and I kind of was getting to the point where I thought like this isn't gonna work. Like maybe it's just not for me. And then it took like, the third try to really like get everything right. And I think just going in knowing that like, it's my freshman year. I'm like running with the kids who have like way more experience, and being aware of that, but also being aware that like I can still, that doesn't mean I can't do something special, but it means that I need to be a little bit more humble and like maybe, yeah, just be open to like learning things while I'm out there, and maybe like paying attention to what other people are doing and try to like, yeah, get some like, I want to say advice, but like, yeah, some like inspiration on how they're managing things. Cause yeah, it's totally uncharted territory. And it's been fun to like try to geek out over all the little things, but I'm sure that there will be something that goes wrong. And yeah, I don't want to say like I'm doing this as like a test run, because I still want this to like go really well, but just being more, I just feel like a little bit more relaxed about being okay with like, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Do you feel like that is like a different approach from maybe when you first went into UTMB? Like maybe that first attempt, is that maybe a shift in mindset based on, you know, seeing your experience after the first two? Like when you went into UTMB, were you like really expecting it to go well? Or tell me if there was like maybe an evolution there, like based on prior experiences.
Yeah, I think my first UTMB, I had just had like a really good result at CCC the year before.
Mm,
And so I was thinking, oh yeah, like I'm going to be so great. Like this is totally for me, like no problem. I'm going to like, you know, surprise everybody. And then I was not ready for it at all. Like it was way too big for me. Not just like the distance, I mean, but just like everything about it was just too much, at that point in my running career. But I think it was important that I did it then. I still like, I don't regret doing it. It just, because the experience I took from that first time I did it, especially, was just like, okay, now I know what it's like. I know what kind of mindset I need to be in, what kind of training, better idea what kind of training I need, like how to prep, you know, just all logistics. So I think it's important to get some experience, especially these like really big events where there is like a lot of external pressure, a lot of people around, and yeah, just like a lot of energy, which is what makes it cool, but also can make it really hard to manage.
for sure. And that's awesome to see that, you know, your approach like really grew like after that first time. And I think a lot of people can relate, maybe if not running, but like it's something in life where like you do something really, really well. And then I know for me, like I've had a great result in the past, and then I go into a next race being like, yeah, like it's gonna go well. And then it's humbling to, you know, be in a new, like, you're like, wow, like this is interesting. But to your point, when you use it as like, hey, like this is an opportunity for me to learn and get better, and not only for the next race, but carrying that dichotomy, like you said before, of knowing that this is the first time, but then at the same time saying, hey, I still can do something great. Like I think that dichotomy is so awesome, because I know for me, it can be easy to hang on one or the other, right? It's like, I can have an amazing race and like, that's what you hold on to. Or it's, I'm, to your point, like just learning, and then it becomes a test race, and then it's like you don't have that competitive. So it's cool to see you balance those two dichotomies, and I'm excited to see you get out and be on the race and experience that for the first time. And I'm so stoked to see all the training coming together and you towing the line at States. It's going to be super, super awesome. And so I have one last question here that I ask everybody on the podcast, a little bit more broader, but before I do, anyone who wants to follow Katie's journey, you know, as she heads into Western States and after too, I'll put all the links to her socials in the show notes. So please check her out. She is super, super awesome with letting people in on the process of her training, and, you know, being one of the best athletes in the sport. It's just a treat to us all to, you know, watch from afar and really get a look inside the process. So we're all appreciative of that. And Katie, for my last question here, more broader speaking, but this show is called Everyday Ultra. The goal of the show is to help our listeners become better endurance athletes every day. So my question to you, my friend, is what can our listeners do every single day to be better endurance athletes?
Oh, it's a good question. You could go a lot of directions with this. I think the best thing to do is just like enjoy what you do, because if you're enjoying something, even if it's really hard, then you're going to get way more out of it. And in the end, this is just like, sports are for fun, right? So we don't need to, it's fun to get serious about things, but you don't have to like take it to the extreme.
Yeah, I love that. And it kind of relates to your earlier answer. It's like, hey, like I love skiing. I don't want to, sacrifice this just for Western states or anything like that, or the logistics around it. And so it's so cool to see you optimizing your life for, the things that you love and going after it. And super cool to see like all, not just the success it's brought you like in races, but the fulfillment as well, which is just super, super awesome. So Katie, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been so awesome chatting with you. Best wishes at the race in California next week, and super stoked and again, super honored for coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, it's fun to catch up.
Absolutely.